It's in order to divide and conquer that the Tories and their Lib Dem props have introduced this measure in the first place. And what I want to try and do, which was the purpose in part of the meeting as well as building for the demo, is to put in this wider context and a socialist viewpoint on what we can do about that. Because it's a tale of human tragedy. It's the tale of people who are stuck in houses not big enough for their needs as a result of the bedroom tax telling them you have to move into a smaller one, if there's any available to go to in the first place. It's a situation where, for example, people with dialysis machines are being taxed £50 a month, to just take a concrete example, for the room where they require the space to operate that life-saving machinery to keep their body functioning. Or it's the case of somebody in, for example, Easter House, where the man had an accident at work, an amputation of one of his legs. The result was it took them about 3 years, I think, to get out of a second-floor house, to get a 4-bedroom house suitable to them, with 3 children. But because, like most families, well, all families obviously, things change. One of the kids is old enough to move out. The other 2 of the same gender. Therefore, they're told they have to live in the 1 bedroom. The result is this family were facing a 25% cut to their housing benefit because of this vicious measure from the Tories and Lib Dems. And of course, it leads to more extreme cases as well. A man, John Walker, 57 years old, from Wigan, who had a number of problems in life, a bit of a drink problem, broke up with his wife, was scrimping and saving to provide for his children, felt guilty of not being capable of doing it properly because of not having a job, and in the end, the post-mortem decided and assessed that it was suicide as a result of the bedroom tax had ended his life. Now, even when people are not driven to that ultimate extreme of taking away their own lives, their own future, because of this measure, even when that is not the case, and there's several of them, I've encountered people as far afield as Ayrshire, for example, where they've told us of a neighbour doing exactly the same, but the family wanted covered up because of the privacy and sensitivity of it. But we also get, however, thousands of people suffering the stress and strain, the worry, the anxiety of the bedroom tax, because already they had the impossible choice between heating and eating as a result of the measures of poverty imposed on them by the government, of slashing their benefits, of slashing their wages in other cases, of prices going up astronomically every day of the week when you go to shop for basics like food, not to mention energy, where they've made billions of pounds of profit because the energy prices have doubled, for example, in the last 5 years, from the energy giants that were privatised by previous governments. And you get that situation where people already were battling to decide, should I eat or heat the house? And now added to those horrible choices is that of trying to save enough to pay a couple of quid towards the bedroom tax, because quite frequently they've been hounded by a social landlord to pay something to avoid going into deeper arrears, with the ultimate threat of eviction hanging over their heads because of what this measure actually does to them. And I got an example from a woman, a pensioner, who has rejoined the Scottish Socialist Party in Glasgow after years of just being disheartened by everything. And she explained that not only was her son facing the prospect of being removed from his disability allowance, but she took up the cudgels, did her homework, went and represented him and prevented it, a rather feisty woman in her 70s. But not only that, but neighbours of hers who are in the church, she's not, but anyway, are in the church and involved in food banks in Ayr, and encountered an example of a family who had walked 8 miles for a food parcel, and they took pity and gave them a lift home. Now that is an indication of 21st century Britain, 21st century Tory Lib Dem rule, 21st century capitalism, a system rooted in profit, and profit sweated out of working class people, whether they're in a job or not able to work for various reasons, including either too old, too sick, too disabled, whatever. And the bedroom tax is just one of the attacks on ordinary people. To put it another way, I think it's only one of the blades in the hands of Scissors Hand Cameron. Because when you look at it, they've tried all sorts of devices to lessen the income of the working class and boost the income of the millionaire class, the bankers and the capitalists. And they've done that whilst constantly trying to divide and conquer us. I won't get into all the different examples just for time's sake. But take the case of disability benefits, where, for example, they've tried to demonise the sick for years, branding them as shirkers, people that are just at it, and of course employed privatised outfits that make billions of profit, like Atos, to drag them into the likes of Cadogan Street, and when they go in, they're unfit for work. Some of them are on death's door, turns out, and yet a miracle cure is performed, hence the nickname Lourdes for Cadogan Street, where the Atos headquarters, with untrained or half-trained individuals with no real medical background, decide that disabled people, sick people, are fit for work and therefore will get a lesser benefit as a result. All as part of a drive to slash the welfare benefits bill and boost the income of the rich on behalf, on the part of the government of the rich down in Westminster. That's one example. Or at the turn of this year, one other example I'll use. The turn of this year, if you remember, they had a real splurge of propaganda in the press about shirkers and workers, skivers and strivers. That was the language of the Tories, but I have to say, it's literally the words of the Labour Party as well, where people like Liam Byrne, the shadow Minister for Welfare and so on, has stated exactly the same language, aimed at those who are not in a job. And all the propaganda and vitriol about when you go to work, the neighbour's curtains being closed and so on, accusing them of being shirkers and of being skivers, sponging off the state, sponging off the taxpayer. And they did that as a build-up to a freeze for 3 years on benefits. And they tried to make it out as if the people affected by those cuts to benefits over 3 years are those out of jobs. But actually, 65% of them are in jobs, because there's things like working tax credit, child benefits, and so on, that were attacked by that freeze for 3 years on benefits levels for a big section of the population. And what I'm saying is that the bedroom tax is just one part of the bigger equation of a weapon used to hammer us into the ground to try and get greater wealth in the hands of the few. And in doing that, they employ a tactic that goes right back to the days of empire, which they practiced in places like Ireland, tried to divide the Protestants from the Catholics, or in places like India, Muslim and Hindu divided in order to conquer their land and their native industry and their people. And of course, it's used nowadays to divide all sorts of nationalities. The numbers of time on the street, I'm sure you've had it when you campaign locally, the numbers of time on the street, you encounter people who say, I agree with you on the bedroom tax, I agree on fighting the Tory government, but it's all these immigrants. In other words, not mention the fact that, of course, as I remind them quite often, they're probably Irish themselves, at least half a generation back. And the point being that they play on division and whip it up with the help of the media in order to weaken us in our resistance to these attacks on working class people's living standards. So the bedroom tax is part of a bigger equation. It's part also of the attack on wages. Wages are now at their lowest share of total national wealth since records on that began in 1955. For example, somebody on 12,000 a year, and if I work full-time, that's the wages a month, but somebody on 12,000 a year would actually be on 23,000 a year if the wages had kept up as a share to the same extent as they were in the mid-70s. And it's not an accidental date, of course, because soon after that you had Thatcher coming in. And then after Thatcher's civil war against the working class, a one-sided civil war in reality, after that you had a new Labour government of Blair and Brown who continued where the Tories had left off. Maybe sometimes appear milder on the surface, maybe, sometimes. But they, for example, the first major measure that Tony Blair introduced was to cut the benefits of single parents. after demonising them in the media for causing social unrest, being responsible for young kids turning into hooligans and other brutal lies like that. Now that is a reminder that regardless of the political lapel, the political rosette that was on the lapel of the Prime Minister in number 10 Downing Street over recent decades, we've had a situation where wages are slashed relatively and absolutely, where jobs are cut, where benefits are cut, and all in order to boost the profit levels of those in charge in ownership of the wealth. Because there's not a recession for them. There's a recession for the rest of us, mainly caused by the greed and extravagance of the bankers. In 2008 it came to a head, where they were handing out loans like there was no tomorrow, so as to make a quick buck off the backs of people that couldn't afford to repay it. And of course credit becomes debt when they decide to call it in. And that situation was created by them. But then we've been asked to pay the price of the crisis caused by the bankers and the billionaires. And we have the position where now we need to fight back against that and try to unite the working class people to the maximum against it. Which is why this demonstration, targeting the Lib Dems in the short term, is very important. It's outrageous what Alan has just described about the police actions, and I hope that the Scottish TUC, for example, they're involved in helping to organise this demonstration, will be using their resources to denounce the creeping measures towards a police state. I don't want to exaggerate. We're obviously not living in Egypt. We're not living in Syria. We're not in that situation of open, naked violence by state forces against protesters. We're not. And let's be clear and keep a sense of perspective. But it's the creeping theft of human rights and democratic rights that's been going on for quite a while. It went on, obviously, as you all know, of a certain age, during the miners' strike of the mid-80s, for example. And it's a militarisation of the country. It's a creeping attack on democratic rights, which must be resisted. And I hope the STUC will be denouncing that as widely as they can through the media, amongst other things, in the run-up to Saturday. Because that demonstration, aimed at the Lib Dems, I think has a very simple, clear purpose. Is to recognise that the coalition carrying out the bedroom tax and the wage cuts and the other benefit cuts, etc., was never elected. It wasn't even elected by the people of England, let alone the people of Scotland. And of course the Scots overwhelmingly voted anti-Tory. So they have no democratic mandate to rule and ruin Scotland. In fact, they don't have a mandate to rule and ruin the United Kingdom, so-called. And therefore, when you look at the conference of the Lib Dems, what's that? That's the conference in the SECC of the yellow Tories who are propping up the blue Tories. They're the Tories' little props. They're little helpers. And if we can show them the fury of the people of Scotland against the bedroom tax specifically, and wield a hammer blow to them and frighten the life out of them, that they face even more oblivion than they already face, unless they go back and think again, as the saying goes, unless they go back to Westminster and move a motion to withdraw their support for the bedroom tax, to have it scrapped, unless they do that, that they will face outright obliteration on the face of this country. And that's the kind of message we need to convey. And by the way, if we hammered and pressured them into doing that, and there's a motion to that effect moved by some of their dissident members, but if we manage to help create that by the pressure of working class people demonstrating, then it would also put Labour on the spot in Westminster. Because let's not be conned by what Labour has said on the bedroom tax. I don't want to spend too long on it, but let me put it this way. Labour invented the predecessor to the bedroom tax, the local housing allowance for the private sector housing. They then said they were against the bedroom tax. But every time they were asked, right up until now, they've refused to declare they'd scrap it. In fact, the same Liam Byrne that talks about shirkers and workers, skivers and strivers along with the Tories, he actually said that if or when Labour comes into power in 2015, they would have to examine the situation in the economy, and they would have to decide, and he repeated this line even I think it was yesterday or the day before, they would have to decide whether the cost of the bedroom tax was more or less than the cost of scrapping it. In other words, the only thing they measure as cost is not the human cost, but the financial cost. And they're not even now, despite the growth of unpopularity, despite the groundswell of rebellion against the bedroom tax all over the country and all over Britain, despite that, they're still not openly, unequivocally saying that if Labour was elected, they would abolish the bedroom tax. Well, I'll put it another way, I'll qualify that. Because if you're watching one channel of television the other night, they were. But over on the other side, they weren't. Because Anna Sawar, Deputy Leader of the Scottish Labour Party, under pressure, said if we were in power tomorrow, we would scrap the bedroom tax. And then Joanne Lamont, his boss, allegedly, on the other channel of television said, along the same lines I've just described from Liam Byrne, well, we think the Tories should scrap it. Will you scrap it? Well, we'll look at the situation as an ongoing situation. Another cowardly waffle like that. In other words, no, we won't. Because in the past, one of the shadow ministers for Labour actually spelt it out. She said, well, actually, we wouldn't scrap it, but we'd only apply it if people were offered smaller accommodation and refused it. So it's a smaller version of the bedroom tax. It's a milder version of the bedroom tax, allegedly, that they want. But consider 96% of people who are affected by the bedroom tax, according to a recent survey of councils and so on, housing associations, 96% of the ones hit by it have no smaller local accommodation available. That must mean that Labour wouldn't keep it 100%, they'd only keep it 96%. So it's absurd and cowardly of them to hide behind phrases such as that. So not even Labour has said that they will scrap the bedroom tax. And the conclusions I'll draw to is that for the Scottish Socialist Party, and I'm sure everybody agrees here, regardless of your politics or otherwise, we don't want to reform the bedroom tax. We don't want to tweak around the edges of it. We don't want to spray deodorant on it and make it less stinking. We want to scrap it. We want it abolished outright so that it doesn't affect anybody. Because there's no justification for it. It doesn't even save money. For example, if the ultimate was to happen and people went into arrears because of it and ended up being evicted, Shelter estimates it costs between 24 and 26,000 for every eviction to the taxpayer in terms of all the overheads of doing that. Leaving aside the cruelty and inhumanity of evictions, something with all the stigma attached to it that goes back to the likes of the 20s and 30s in cities like this and elsewhere. So we want it scrapped. And we're quite clear that although that's a Westminster power, a Westminster decision, that there's powers on the ground at council level, at housing association level and at Scottish Government level that should be used to help to force this abolition. Starting on ground level, we've joined with others in organising anti-eviction squads, whatever you want to call it, whatever name you want to put to it, but in order to protect people from that threat. That's one side of what we're doing. We've also organised all over the country lobbies and protests at housing association headquarters, at council buildings and so on, and demanded that they declare there'll be no evictions in terms of bedroom tax. We're not the only people doing it, but we've done it. And we've argued that if they said that, and enough of them said it, it'd become inoperable. It couldn't function. We've also, however, said that the Scottish Government, the SNP government, should come down off the fence and say there will be no evictions whatsoever in Scotland under the bedroom tax, whether it's council or housing association. It's to their credit that it was SNP councils that first said there'd be no evictions, although I'll come back to that in a moment. However, they need to go further. The SNP government, with the absolute majority that they have, should declare there'll be no evictions whatsoever. They're outlawed on the housing legislation they've got power over. They'll be outlawed, and that would lift the burden of stress and worry from the heads of so many tenants, roughly 100,000 households across Scotland, for starters. We've also said that the housing associations, the councils, should reclassify rooms so as to declare, for whatever reasons, doesn't matter what reason to give, that's not a bedroom. Some authorities have done that. That should be done throughout in order to dodge liability for the bedroom tax. And then, of course, when we've raised that, Labour has belatedly come behind that idea, but purely to play politics with the SNP government. They're moving a motion in the Scottish Parliament to that effect, even though it was a Labour council that issued the first real eviction notices in the likes of North Lanarkshire against a woman in a wheelchair, severely disabled, with children. Now, there wasn't much doubt about what they were trying to do until the fury of local people erupted and stopped it from happening. But that is the rank hypocrisy of the Labour Party. But the SNP have, to their credit, said that if they were elected in an independent Scotland, which therefore has the powers over welfare, they would abolish the bedroom tax. And we applaud that. But we think they need to take steps before that happens. We can't wait to 2016, 2017, 2018, whenever there was outright independence, for example. We as a party campaigned for independence. We've done that since we were set up almost exactly 15 years ago to the day, the end of this month. It's the 15th anniversary of setting up the Scottish Socialist Party. We've always argued for an independent socialist Scotland. We're fighting for a yes vote to give powers over things like welfare, for example, and things like the level of minimum wage, and the level of pensions, and the level of profiteering, and the right to take banks and big industry and other things into democratic public ownership. Those measures that would end the vicious inequality that we face in this country. But on the bedroom tax, we think rather than wait till independence, there's measures now that the SNP government could take. For example, they could give the 53 million guesstimated shortfall in rental stream to social landlords, housing associations and councils. They could give that to those social landlords and say, that's what you're losing because of the bedroom tax. Here it is, out of the government's funds in Holyrood for this year, whilst we build a campaign of rebellion of the Scots to drive out the Tory government, the Lib Dem Tory government, that has actually created the bedroom tax in the first place. And that would remove the dilemma that particularly smaller housing associations face. And I know first hand here, because although I pay full rent, because I'm in a housing association flat, but because I'm working, me and my partner both, we pay full rent. But because of the job she has, trained to assist tenants as a welfare rights officer for a housing association, the boss is on 100,000 a year, I corrected 102,000 a year now, of that housing association have declared redundancies and pay cuts of £5,000 for staff with 20 and 30 years service to the community where she works. Now, we're determined to try and build unity between tenants and workers, staff and tenants, because both face the cudgel of the consequence of the bedroom tax. And that's where if the SNP government stepped in and said, look, we confess we had an underspend in our budget last year of £179 million, not spent in the actual budget. We'll take less than a third of that, 53 million, give it to the social landlords of Scotland and say there's compensation for what you lose on the bedroom tax, and it means you don't have to start hounding a single tenant that's affected by it, liable for it, for a single penny of bedroom tax payment. It would remove the excuse for evictions, or the reason for evictions. It would remove every excuse for job cuts, pay cuts, service cuts. It would defend what we've got, which is little enough, and defend the miserly incomes of those affected directly by bedroom tax payments. That's some of the things that the SSP and others, of course, are fighting for. And I'll finish on this. We stand for the abolition of the bedroom tax. But like I said, as part of a bigger picture, a system of brutal exploitation, of wages being far lower than the wealth that you produce when you go to work, of benefits being so low you can't survive, of a tax on different minorities within society, so as to pick one off at a time, divide and conquer on behalf of the millionaires, the bankers and the billionaires. That's the kind of country society we live in. We want an entirely different one. Yes, we want to scrap the bedroom tax. We'll unite with anybody in order to try and achieve that. Yes, we want to get rid of it, but we also want to not have to run like you run on a treadmill all the time. We want a society where the fabulous wealth that exists in Scotland is used for the benefits of the millions, not the millionaires. Not for the benefit of Brian Souter instead of Richard Branson. Not for the benefit of capitalists dressed in kilts rather than wearing Union Jack knickers or something. We want a society where the minimum wage is a real living wage. We think it should be 2/3 the average male wage, which would be £9 or £10 a week. That's their idea. £9 or £10 an hour. We think pensions should be attached to that. We think a student grant should be introduced. That means students of any age can live, survive and study according to their wishes. We believe there should be a reversal of all privatisation, that the wealth in the North Sea and on land and wind and sun should be harnessed to the benefit of the population and to prevent poverty and pollution. We believe in a socialist society where the wealth of the millionaires and the big businesses is brought into democratic common ownership in the form of public ownership in different forms, democratic control of it, working class involvement in the running of industries and services and so on. We're a democratic socialist party that strives for that kind of future. So my parting shot in this speech is this: join together on Saturday. Join together in building for Saturday in the meantime, locally. Join together in fighting to bin the bedroom tax and to prevent any future threats of evictions if that arises. But also, consider as an individual, consider joining the Scottish Socialist Party to build a force that will change the face of Scotland into one where ordinary people are in charge and the wealth is used for the benefit of all. And thanks for listening.